This is Chapter 13 of the State and Local Government, and we'll be looking at taxing and spending at the state and local level. So we've got different interdependencies going on with our financial system. And when I'm talking about taxation, we're talking about generating revenue and contributes about $3 trillion of its own source revenues, which means the state is generating those themselves. This includes taxes, charges, user fees, license fees, lots of things that states do to try to generate revenue. About 1/4 of all state and local revenue is from intergovernmental transfers. National government provides about 1/4 of state and local revenue. For example, 60% of that is passed through to individuals, such as programs such as Medicaid. So these are direct expenditures that are coming from the federal government to states. And whenever we have a recession, stimulus programs are trying to help the states, which cannot run a deficit. So during the recession, 2008 to 2011, stimulus programs from the federal government offset about 40% of the state budget deficits. So that's kind of how our federal system works there. We've got quite a diversity of revenue sources that the states do, and sales tax is one we'll talk about. We'll talk about property taxes, income taxes. We'll talk about miscellaneous user fees and charges here. So let's take a look at some of those. First of all, when we talk about the variety between states as far as their what we call tax burden, and so this is state and local taxes as a percent of income. The United States average is about 9%, 9.8% of the income is state and local taxes. And this gives you a list of the states that are higher than the national average. And as you can see, New York and New Jersey here in our area have the highest tax burdens. That's something that you could investigate further as to why that is. When we look at the national picture, we see that states such as Texas and Wyoming and Alaska have relatively smaller or in the lower range of tax burdens as far as percentage, in this case, percentage of state income. Here's a pie chart showing where the state and local revenues come from by source. So here we see sales taxes around 18%, miscellaneous charges around 24%, property taxes around 17%, individual income taxes around 12%, and then the intergovernmental revenue from the federal government around 23%. Here's it's broken up a little bit more as far as share of state revenues and sources of local revenues. So you can see some differences here. Quite a bit of the sources of local revenue come from property taxes. So that's a big difference. Don't see any of that to speak of on the state side. Transfers still predominantly larger on either one when you separate them out. We see general sales tax pretty big at the state level. Corporate income tax considerably lower than it used to be as far as the total sources or total state revenue, where that comes from. Now, there's certain criteria for evaluating taxes from state to state. What was called the equity of burden determines whether or not we want this to be a regressive tax or a progressive tax. What we do see is that income taxes are generally progressive. That means that the more money you make, the higher percentage of tax that you pay. And that is turned out to be somewhat of a norm in Western democracies as being more fair to do it that way. It also does provide this benefit of what is called tax elasticity, that when the economy improves and the economy is booming, for example, that means more people are working and therefore you're collecting more taxes, and even on top of that, people are actually getting pushed up into higher tax brackets by making more money. So therefore, you increase your revenues without having to change the tax code. Now, regressive tax typically is a flat tax because it would burden the lower income a little bit more than the higher income. And then another way of generating revenue is through the benefit principle, and this is where the user of that service pays for that. Now, there's lots of public goods and services that we pay for directly, such as electricity and water, but there's also public transportation that is financed by the user who pays to get on and use that particular thing. Tax yield is just a term that tries to measure or compare different types of taxations, and this is defined as the money contributed compared to the effort expended. So clearly you would want to expend little effort and still contribute and get a lot of revenue, right? That would make sense. And so therefore we see that income taxes and sales taxes, which are the most go-to types of taxes, they have a high yield because they can get more money compared to the effort that's expended to get that. Whereas property taxes has a lower yield because you have to put in a lot of effort to determine what those property evaluations are from neighborhood to neighborhood. And so the yield compared to how much effort it is to get that yield is lower. So let's talk about a few of these different types. Let's look at property tax, which generally remains unpopular because people that live in the higher income residential neighborhoods get taxed higher because of the value of their property. But we see that this is where the bulk of the local government revenue comes from that they can generate themselves, particularly for schools that we've touched on a little bit already. And there have been pushbacks on this, taxpayer revolts, such as the Proposition 13 in California, which was trying to push back against the higher property taxes. And in most areas, exemptions are given to things like hospitals, churches, and low-income areas exempt from paying property taxes, and that again probably increases a little bit of the criticisms regarding property tax. And as I've already kind of touched on here, it varies quite a bit from state to state, and we've already looked at how even some school districts have been their funding has been found unconstitutional because the amount of revenue that's generated in one neighborhood is considerably more than another neighborhood. So the schools are quite dramatically different in the resources that they have or what they can pay. Looking at sales tax, this accounts for about 1/2 of the state-owned source revenues, and voters have increasingly been preferring sales tax over income taxes. It might be less onerous as to prepare for that and pay for it. It may also be perceptions, that sort of thing, that if I choose to go out and buy a product, well, then I'm willing to pay a sales tax on it, where there's the government forcing me to pay a tax on how much I'm making for my company. You know, those are just some perceptions that we're having to deal with increasingly in our society, where people increasingly do not want to pay taxes, but yet we still want government to do the same services that they've always done and more. So 36 states authorize local sales taxes, where the municipalities can also collect. And the sales tax, one of the reasons why it's criticized as a go-to rather than income tax, well, sales tax is regressive, so the poor spend a larger portion of their income to buy potentially the same products that the wealthy pay. But of course, the wealthy are obviously going to buy more products, so it yes, there is somewhat of a trade-off there, but considering that it's regressive, that's why the the progressive income tax seems a little bit more fair as far as a revenue generator. More on sales taxes. States are broadening the tax base in order to include services. So there's, rather than in addition to just products, they're starting to pass laws to tax services in order to bring in more revenue. The internet, which came about in the 90s, was a new phenomenon, and early on the United States Supreme Court blocked state taxation of out-of-state retailers. So that means that people that were ordering goods from another state, the state that the product was coming to, they could not tax that. And this has been estimated at a loss of $5 billion per year in revenue by not being able to do that. And just in the last decade or so, we have several states that have passed streamlined sales tax legislation to include internet jurisdictions. And you may have even noticed yourself that just over the past few years that Amazon.com was eventually required to include sales tax on those transactions, whereas up until a few years ago, they did not add a sales tax to that. That's so that the states could generate some revenue from that, as they would if that store was in their state or that the buyer was in their state. Looking at income tax, still a pretty big source of own source revenues, about 28%. 41 states have an income tax. I originally from Texas, which did not have a state income tax, so that was a transition that I made when I came to New Jersey. Corporate taxes have been getting increasingly lower over the years. Only about 4% of the own source revenues are from corporate taxes, and that's probably even lowered since this book was written. And 15 states actually permit their local entities, the states and municipalities, to have income tax as well. And 8 states have a flat tax, which is considered regressive in this income tax realm, because if everybody's paying the same percent, then that is going to, as far as comparatively speaking, the poor are going to be paying more relative to what they have. So that's why flat taxes are not as popular, because they are regressive. Looking at some miscellaneous taxes and revenues here, sin taxes are increasingly popular. If there's any type of behavior that we perhaps want to curtail, such as smoking or drinking, those get taxed really heavily. Cigarettes have been taxed enormously. When you look at a pack of cigarettes that might cost $10, about 80% of that is taxed, and that is served to help curtail cigarette consumption, which was a huge social cost. The states that have legalized marijuana in some form or other are getting relatively small amount of tax revenue from that, even though that was a big selling point for legalization, that states would reap all these millions and millions of dollars of taxes, but comparatively speaking, still pretty insignificant. And even taxing of alcoholic beverages is a source of revenue for these sin taxes. Gas tax is a tax that could be imposed to curtail driving. So that might serve 2 purposes. You're trying to curtail driving in order to reduce greenhouse gases, while at the same time generate some revenue, similar to taxing cigarettes, I suppose, if you're assuming that we want to cut back on fossil fuel emissions. Estate taxes are looking at taxing the assets of deceased, and perhaps even some inheritance taxes are part of that as well. And then there's lots of variety of licenses that you have to pay for that go to the revenue for the state and local governments, fees to operate certain things, tickets to certain things, even the fines that you pay for traffic. Those are sources of revenues. A fairly creative thing that some states have enacted is called the jock tax, is when a a superstar athlete who makes millions of dollars a year, when they go play in another state that they don't live in, well, then they're taxed to go play in that particular arena in that state. So again, they make enough money to where it's it's not that big of a burden if you're making a lot of money, but it is certainly a sore spot for lower paid athletes that would still have to pay this. But that just goes to show you how creative states have to get in order to raise revenues to provide the services that we want them to provide and not run a deficit, because they have to balance their budgets. Various user fees, we've already talked about the benefit principle. We also looking at schools where students pay tuition, which, for example, at this school, over 50, close to 60% of the financing of the school is through tuition of the students. Again, use of water service, you pay for the water bill, and or perhaps trash collection, that's part of the bill that you're paying to the city. Even perhaps entry fees to get into parks, toll roads, as I've already talked about, are an increasingly common method of raising revenue to where the state does not have to use their tax revenues to pay for this new road. They can authorize the toll road authority to build that by selling revenue bonds and then collecting tolls. And these user fees are generally acceptable to the public, but it may also kind of prevent the lower income people from using these facilities. So that's always, you have to weigh that into the equation. And we've also in the previous chapter talked about impact fees on developers in order to, because a private development is going to have water services that come to it. Electricity has to come to it. Sewer lines have to be built out to it. So an impact fee on these private developers that could potentially make a lot of money off of selling this development here to whether it's residential or commercial buyers, well, then that would help to pay cost of that infrastructure to that development and within that development. A severance tax is a tax on natural resources or a tax on exporting to some other state. So the opposite of a tariff, I guess you could say, to be able to export to some other states, you're getting a little bit of tax on that, and it's fairly localized here because there's only 10 states in the U.S. that collect 90% of all the severance tax that's collected. So these are the states that are high in oil, coal, natural gas consumption, or specialize in things like oysters and salmon. And if it's almost like the resource curse on the national level, if a country becomes too dependent on one resource such as oil, well, you've got to be careful if you become too dependent on that particular revenue source, because if that resource declines or if oil prices decrease, well, then you're going to get really hit hard on your revenue. And looking at a bigger picture, that's what happened to Russia, and particularly hit Venezuela very hard when they were relying so much on their oil revenue. When the prices dropped, it contributed to their decline, and now Venezuela is getting serious problems. So looking on the state level in the United States, same thing. You'd have to watch out for being too dependent on that. Other revenues that have been popping up over the recent years are taxing gambling activities, lotteries, and pari-mutuel betting, which includes horse racing, dog racing, things like that. 45 states now have approved lotteries, and what we see is about 60% of the money that's collected is returned as prize money, because the dual purpose of the lottery is to incentivize people to buy tickets so that they could have a chance to win this big prize. But at the same time, you're using that money, part of that money, to raise revenues for other services. And the state has to decide where that money's going to go. But there's a lot of social costs that are attached to this, and also it's a relatively low yield when you look at the efforts that are required to run lotteries and to do these things, and it's still a relatively small percent of total revenues. And it is very regressive in that, particularly with lottery tickets, the vast majority of them come from lower income people, and lotteries have in fact been sarcastically referred to as poor people's tax because of that. There's also other avenues to legalize internet gambling, which some states have. Could bring in as much as $3 billion more overall in tax revenue, but then again, you'd have to look at the social costs of that as to what that could be doing to people's incomes if they get addicted to it. Speaking of lotteries, Americans spend about $70 billion a year, and that's about $300 per adult, but we already know that that's disproportionately loaded towards a smaller sector of the population. And here's a stat here that households with incomes less than $13,000 spend this much on average a year on tickets, and as you can see, that's about 9% of their income. So it's a almost like a tax on lower income people. But here's gives you another perspective. 11 states raise more from their lotteries than they do from corporate income taxes, which is another thing that you would question and say, wow, this is a big transition from what it used to be when corporate entities would pay more of the share of this burden in order to operate in the state and become very successful and generate a lot of profit. But yet over the years, they have been steadily declining in the amount of corporate taxes that they've paid because governments have been either letting them do that or legislating them lower taxes, and then going to things like lotteries in order to make up that difference. So an interesting trend. Now, shifting the gears towards spending, we see that you can't spend unless you collect it, so therefore it's tied obviously to the tax that you can collect. But we do know that spending increases with population growth and complexity. It's just hard to get around that. If more people are entering your society, you're going to have to pay more to provide them more services. And with the complexity of society, people are needing and wanting more from government that the market system, or capitalism with its potential problems, is not providing for everyone. So the state, local governments have to kind of pick up on that. And so that's also resulted in an increase of the demand for the services that the state and local governments provide. So we've already mentioned this paradox that we are stuck in. People want more from government, but we do not want to pay more for it. What we also are seeing here is no tax pledges, where the certain ideological factions of government are literally requiring their members to sign pledges that they're not going to raise taxes. And so therefore, if they're committed to that, then they've got to figure out other ways to raise revenue. Now, looking at the pie chart on spending, we see that this is the total for the state government overall. So about 20% on primary and secondary education. We see about 10% on higher education. So those go to what we call the public universities in the state. Big chunk on Medicaid because healthcare costs are getting higher. More people are less and less able to afford healthcare, so that number is most certainly going up as we speak. So that gives you a breakdown of what state governments spend their money on. And earlier we looked at what state governments, where they get their money from. Now, fiscal stress just means that you've got conflicts in what you have to spend on, and the recession that we went through, or any potential recession that we could go through, increases that fiscal stress because you may have jobs that are leaving the state, and you may have more people congregating in your state, and that is not only going to decline revenue, it's going to increase the amount that you need to spend for public services. We have already talked about how infrastructure throughout the United States is on the decline because we don't spend more money in order to improve them or replace them. And we're looking at bridges that are way beyond the point of inspections and perhaps maintenance, as well as water systems where we have a pretty significant percentage of water that's lost through leaky pipes or water that's poor quality from rusty pipes. And these problems, because all states share these same problems, they require federal attention. And our federal government, of course, is bordering on dysfunctional as far as the political polarization, and they're then therefore kind of delegating it down for the states to do, which don't have the funds to do it. And so then that increases borrowing through things like municipal bonds and the potential for deficits, which states are not technically allowed to have. And so that's another thing down the road. How are they going to work around this? They could potentially owe a lot of money and not perhaps call it a deficit. And so this is just a recent disaster where a bridge collapsed and came out later on from that was way past inspection. With inspections and maintenance and upkeep, it certainly could have been prevented. Now, as far as the discretion that one state has, it's somewhat limited because, particularly in our capitalist society, private firms can use states to compete against each other for those jobs. And they can say, well, if you're not going to give me these breaks, these tax breaks, or this free property rental or whatever, that we're going to go to another state. So this competition between states for jobs literally puts more power in the hands of the private corporations and more burden on the state governments. And that, interestingly enough, this is something that the federal government could address as well and say, sorry, you can't do that, Mr. Private Corporation. For example, when Amazon came up with this big, huge contest that had over 200 areas that were competing for their big location, and they came down in an area where most people predicted that's where they would have probably gone anyway, even if they didn't have this contest. And then as soon as New York starts to push back a little bit on some of these huge subsidies and tax breaks that they were going to give one of the richest corporations in the entire world in order to land in this particular state, well, then the corporation just kind of got miffed and said, okay, well, we're not going to do it here. And so that's a very interesting situation where the states are pitted against each other to provide these huge breaks that are declining the revenues, and the corporations are pretty much not held accountable in order to be able to do that, when yet the federal government could literally solve that problem and say, no, you just can't do that. Just pick a spot and go there. Pick a spot that meets your needs the best. And then another thing that states might have a little bit of discretion on is earmarking or designating what those taxes are going to be. So they might create a gas tax that would go specifically for building roads or maintaining roads. And balancing the budget is one of their challenges. And when the federal government is mandating them to do something and not giving them money for it, that's always been a long sore spot among states where they are required by a new federal government law or regulation to do something, but yet they're not getting additional money from the federal government in order to enact that policy. And healthcare is a major crisis looming because of the rising healthcare costs, and they are going to be eventually underfunded in their liabilities to provide healthcare to the people. And so one of the things that's going to happen there is that more than likely the government, it's in some way or form, is going to have to address the rising health care costs. So again, even though we are looking at state and local governments here, we live in a federalist system where the states interact with federal government, and in many cases, require or need help from the federal government. As we saw before, that states pretty much all have balanced budget requirements, and when you're estimating the revenues, that could be a very time-consuming process. So what they typically do, as in a lot of budgeting, as we mentioned before, it's incremental extrapolation. Rather than trying to model as to what you might need in the future, that might take more time, effort, and money to try to figure that out. Whereas if they just muddle through or incrementally go from one year to the next with incremental increases, that seems to be the typical way to go. And rainy day funds are in jeopardy of getting tapped fairly quickly in any type of situation where revenues are short. Well, rainy day funds are there for them to use, but they could get tapped out fairly quickly. Now, what states do with their money, if they have money on hand, is try to invest it in order to generate revenue from their investments as well. So whether it's short-term treasury notes, money market accounts, treasury bills, CDs, there's various financial instruments that the state financial officers would try to generate revenue from, just as a company might do that, or a financial firm might try to do that. Pension funds are, in many cases, the biggest responsibility as far as financial instruments go. And we see that there's the recession. We see a large gap between what states have promised and what they have the ability to pay. And so that could be a little bit of a concern in the long term of people that have been working for the state and are expecting this pension fund when they retire, and it potentially may not be there, or that at some point they would have to transfer that into something else. It's not as though that they would just say, sorry, there's no money for you when you retire. More than likely, they're going to have to transfer that pension fund to more of a 401k type account, something like that. And we saw that particularly during the run-up to the recession, that there was a lot of additional risk taking through these derivatives, which are just increasingly creative financial instruments where you take a risk that you already have and you slice it up and then sell that to spread out that risk. That once those derivatives became exposed, then our United States economy almost collapsed because of the over leveraging that was involved with this risk taking. Now, as far as long-term borrowing for states, there's things called general obligation bonds, where you could use these to finance public projects, and the lenders to the city or the state of these bonds would be guaranteed repayment. So therefore, there'd have to be some assurance there that money was going to be generated from this public project. And we've already talked about revenue bonds, where a specific project could be built, such as a toll road, and the money would come from a specific source. And in either case, the revenue generated from these would be paid back to the bondholders or the investors. And industrial development bonds are used to construct facilities that would be used by the private industry. So the private industry, therefore, is taking part in this investment opportunity. And these are some internet resources for this particular chapter on taxing and spending.